Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be talking about part 4 of the Chronicles of blues rock guitar tones from the 60s and the 70s. Now before we get started, please like, share and subscribe. Really appreciate that. So let's get started. Now this part will be tackling the psychedelic rock aspect of blues rock music from the 60s and the 70s. Now, psychedelic rock is a very vast genre and it was very popular in the 60s and the 70s. So many bands and artists were experimenting with the sound or the visuals, and this is due to many reasons. I'm not gonna get to that, I'll just focus on the guitar tone. So when it comes to these artists and bands, not all of them were experimenting heavily with the sound as much as others. Some bands like Strawberry Alarm Clock were very psychedelic sounding, but yet they incorporated the blues rock elements very effectively in their music. Some other bands like Cream, for example, they did the psychedelic rock thing, but it was much more mild. Some bands like Led Zeppelin, people argue they were never psychedelic, but some bands like the Beatles experimented heavily with psychedelic music for a very long time. Some bands like Jefferson Airplane or Big Brother and the Holding Company were very folk-oriented and still experimented with some aspects of the psychedelic rock. And depending on the band, some of them were just using like a very big like Marshall-y fuzzy tones like Jimi Hendrix Experience, but some others were much more mild, like Pink Floyd, for example. So this video will be just focusing on the effects. How you choose to use them is really up to you, and how do you choose to set up your entire rig is also up to you. Now please watch my previous parts about the Chronicles of blues rock guitar tones to get more ideas about the aspects beyond just the effects. I was talking mostly about amplifiers and different guitars and different pickups. Those I think are the foundation. The psychedelic rock element is just an element, especially for the guitars. You need to understand that most of that psychedelic rock music from the 60s and the 70s were not coming only from the guitar or the guitar player. It was coming from keyboard players or studio effects, etc. So for this video, I'm using my Telecaster into my Marshall, and this is how it sounds like without any effects on. And if I pick harder, it will sound like this. Now the first effect I'll talk about is wah pedals. Wah pedals are very cool, and they are very synonymous with so many types of music. Now when it comes to wah pedals, they can sound very excessive or annoying, to be honest, if you're using them all the time. However, think about how many more times by Led Zeppelin or Jimi Hendrix when he was playing all these leads that used wah pedals, or how Cream incorporated the wah pedal in Tales of Brave Ulysses or White Room, etc. You can use them in a musical way, not necessarily only when you're playing lead. Let's tackle some of the modulation effects that were popular in the 60s. Univibe effects are really cool. I think they have this instant 60s vibe. Yeah, that just sounds really good. In my opinion, Univibe can be very excessive, or you can use it in a very subtle way. In this video, I'll demonstrate it. I'm using the JHS Unicorn pedal. This is a faithful recreation of the first Univibe pedals that were being used back in the 60s. And this is how it sounds like. It kind of sounds like a tremolo, but more three-dimensional, if that makes sense. Now, speaking about tremolo, tremolo is also really cool, and also vibrato. However, tremolo and vibrato were being used in the 60s, but not necessarily with the psychedelic rock music. But I would suggest, if you want to get more variety when it comes to your modulation sounds or effects, I would recommend experimenting with those as well. But for me, if I'm going for that tone, Univibe is going to win all the time, very easily. So the one thing I need to mention before we move into the time-based effects is phasers. Phasers are very highly associated with the 80s music, especially if you're using lots of gain in your sound. However, I think phasers are very synonymous with 70s psychedelic rock. Phasers did not exist in the 60s, and yes, they do sound close to Univibes in some certain settings, but they are still different. Now, in my opinion, if you're gonna use phasers, one recommendation is don't use too much gain, and try to make it sound more subtle, because it can easily drift into that 80s glam rock tones, which is fine if that's what you're into, but that's my recommendation if you want something that sounds much more vintage-like. Now let's get into the time-based effects. Now, time-based effects are really cool, especially for psychedelic rock. When it comes to time-based effects, I'll talk first about the delay, because there's a little bit more to cover than the reverb. You get so many types of delay, but there are only two delay effects that I would recommend. There is the tape delay and reverse delay. This is probably going to be the only video where I talk about reverse delay. Now, before we get into the reverse delay, let's just get it over with the tape delay. Tape delay was being used a lot back in the day, especially by people like Jimmy Page. And again, if you go into any of the Led Zeppelin records, especially the first two, so many of these, like those verses in the song that is very mild and it just sounds very psychedelic, and you hear like lots of percussion and lots of sweeping guitar sounds. Lots of those effects, of course, were being generated by some studio effects, by the genius of Jimmy Page, but also tape delay. You get this wash of sound that is really cool to experiment with. So it sounds like this. Now you can see how it adds lots of texture and lots of character to the sound. Now let's demonstrate the reverse delay. Very cool, not as cool as Jimi Hendrix and Are You Experienced, the song. He did use it in the intro in a very effective way, but I think this is kind of like a secret weapon kind of thing, like for maybe one part of a song that you can incorporate and easily just steal the show. And I think it changes the way I'm playing to some extent. You want the delay to be very visible. Now, of course, you can change the settings. Some pedals are very capable of giving you something that's very extreme, and some are more subtle. Now, last but not least is the reverb. When it comes to reverb, I think it's pretty simple. Spring reverb was very synonymous with 60s and 70s music, so I definitely recommend that. Now, I was playing the reverb in the first riffs in the beginning of the video. Now, I'm not going to demonstrate the reverb by itself. I think it's just gonna sound like spring reverb. But I'll try to do one thing. I'll try to do Univibe with spring reverb and see how it sounds like. So it sounds like this. definitely adds more awesomeness to the overall tone. But this is the thing, so many bands were using lots of clean guitars. They were not just using lots of fuzz and lots of saturation. So I feel the cleaner the guitar, the more you can get away with more effects at the same time. It's very easy to just go and buy all of these effects and put them in front of your amp, crank your fuzz pedal, and just run them all together. And it's gonna sound like a mess and just a huge wash of sound that's just incoherent. You still want the guitar to have its own character. You don't want just to sound like effects. So be careful with that. Use 1 to 2 effects mostly at the time, especially if you're using lots of gain. All the examples I mentioned, they were basically just using one effect, like one pedal or two at the time maximum. There weren't the concept of using like lots of effects at the same time or having like a big pedal board did not exist. Now again, I like experimenting with effects, and I imagine you do as well because you're watching this video. Go ahead and experiment with it. But just remember, it can be distracting from the actual playing also. So don't become like obsessed with effects and leave the actual playing, which is the most important part. Now, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you like this video. This was a little bit different from what I usually do. I was more focused on the effects, but that's the entire point of Psychedelic Rock. So thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, all these awesome things. Let me know what you think in the comment section, and please share this video on the gear page, of course. Thank you so much.